Hey there, fellow deep divers. Ready to dive into some fascinating waters?
Always.
Awesome. Well, today we're going to be wading into the world of gender studies.
Sounds good.
Specifically, we're going to be looking at the work of Judith Butler.
Ah, Judith Butler, a thinker who really shook things up, huh?
Yeah, for sure. And we're going to be exploring, her ideas about how gender and identity are socially constructed.
Right, through things like language and power. It's pretty complex stuff.
It is. And Butler's work in this area is really groundbreaking. But before we jump in, I think it's important to understand why this is all so, important.
Absolutely. For a long time, we've kind of taken for granted these ideas about sex and gender and desire, assuming they're all, naturally aligned.
Right, like I was born a woman, therefore I am feminine and attracted to man, that sort of thing.
Exactly. But Butler comes along and throws a wrench in all of that.
A big wrench.
A big one. She basically says, hold on a minute, let's unpack all of these assumptions.
I like that. Unpacking assumptions. So where do we even begin with this unpacking?
Well, a good place to start is with Butler's concept of subjects of sex, gender, desire. It's kind of like a core idea in her work.
Okay, subjects of sex, gender, desire. What does that even mean?
It's basically this idea that these three things, sex, gender, and desire, aren't inherently linked.
Oh, interesting. So they're not just automatically a package deal?
Nope. Butler suggests that they're actually separate and subject to a whole lot of cultural influence.
Cultural influence. So it's not just about our biology then?
Not entirely, no. It's about how society shapes our understanding of these things.
So instead of saying, I was born a woman, we should be saying what?
Well, it's more about recognizing that being assigned female at birth doesn't automatically determine your gender identity or who you're attracted to.
Okay, I'm starting to see where this is going. And I'm already feeling a bit of gender trouble myself.
Gender trouble is a good thing. It means we're starting to question those assumptions.
Right. So if gender isn't just something we're born with, where does it come from then?
That's where things get really interesting. Butler argues that it's something we become through a process of socialization.
Socialization. So basically through how we're raised and the messages we receive from the world around us.
Exactly. Think about all the things that contribute to shaping our understanding of gender, like the clothes we wear, the toys we play with.
And the way people talk to us, right? Like boys are told to be tough and girls are told to be nice, that kind of thing.
Exactly. All of these things contribute to creating these expectations of what it means to be a man or a woman.
And those expectations can be pretty powerful, can't they?
Oh, absolutely. They shape our behavior, our relationships, even our sense of self.
It's like we're handed this script to follow. And the more we perform it, the more it becomes who we are.
That's a great way to put it. It's a performance, in a way. And if we step outside those lines, things can get, troubling, as Butler puts it.
Right, because we're challenging the norms, disrupting those expectations.
And that's where the power aspect comes in. There are social forces that work to maintain these gender norms.
So there's this pressure to conform, to perform our gender in a way that's considered, acceptable by society.
Exactly. Butler uses the word intelligible, like our gender needs to be intelligible to others in order to be accepted.
Intelligible genders. What makes a gender intelligible then?
Basically, it's about fitting neatly into that dominant cultural narrative, where sex, gender, and desire all line up in a predictable way.
Okay, give me an example.
Sure. Like someone who is assigned male at birth, identifies as a man, and is attracted to women, that would be considered an intelligible gender identity.
Because it conforms to the traditional expectations, right?
Right. But if any of those pieces don't line up, it throws the whole system into disarray.
And that's where things can get challenging for individuals who don't fit those narrow categories.
Absolutely. And this is where Butler's work can be so liberating for folks who have felt marginalized because their gender identity doesn't fit the norm.
It's like she's saying, hey, those categories are arbitrary. You don't have to be bound by them.
Exactly.
I'm really starting to see how this all connects, how these ideas challenge not only how we understand gender, but also how we understand power and how these things intersect.
It's all connected, for sure. And it's not just about gender, right? It's about how power operates to shape our identities in all sorts of ways.
This is some deep stuff. But before we go any further, let's take a break. When we come back, I want to hear more about how this all plays out in our everyday lives.
Sounds good to me. So we've been talking about how Judith Butler's work kind of throws a wrench into traditional ideas about gender.
Yeah, pretty big wrench, I'd say.
And one of the key concepts she introduces is this idea of gender trouble.
Gender trouble sounds a bit I don't know,
No,
rebellion.
it definitely is. It's about challenging those norms, disrupting those expectations.
Okay, I'm all for a little troublemaking. But how do we actually create this gender trouble?
Well, Butler suggests that one way to do this is through what she calls subversive repetition.
Subversive repetition. Okay, you're going to have to break that down for me.
Think of it this way. When we repeat something over and over again, it loses its original meaning, right?
Yeah, it becomes less, I don't know, authentic.
Exactly. So Butler's idea is that if we take those gender norms, those rigid scripts we've been talking about, and we repeat them in a way that's exaggerated or ironic, we can start to undermine their power.
Ah, I see. It's like taking those old tropes and turning them on their head, right?
Exactly. Like instead of just accepting the idea that women should be delicate and submissive, we could, crank up the femininity to an almost absurd level.
Make it so over the top that it exposes the artificiality of the whole performance.
Precisely. And in doing so, we reveal just how constructed those categories really are.
Okay, I'm getting it. So by playing with these gender norms, we can expose their artificiality and potentially open up space for new ways of being.
That's the idea. It's about using those norms against themselves, in a way.
I like it. But how does this individual act of subversion translate into broader social change? I mean, it's one thing to wear a fabulous outfit that bends the rules, but does that actually shift the power dynamics?
That's a great question, and it's where things get really interesting. Butler doesn't see these subversive acts as just personal expressions of rebellion.
Oh,
She argues that they can actually have a ripple effect, disrupting that dominant gender binary and creating these little cracks in the system.
so each individual act of gender trouble sends out these little shockwaves.
Exactly. And over time, those shockwaves can build up and start to dismantle those rigid structures that have been holding us back.
I love that imagery. It's like we can all be little rebels shaking things up in our own unique ways.
Exactly. And the more people who participate, the more those shockwaves will multiply and intensify.
Leading to a more fluid and inclusive understanding of gender.
Precisely.
But let's go back to this idea of power for a moment.
Mm.
We've been talking about how it shapes our understanding of gender, but how does it actually work?
Well, it's not just about some shadowy figure lurking in the background, dictating our every move. It's much more subtle than that.
More subtle. In what way?
Well, Butler draws on the ideas of Michel Foucault, who argued that power isn't just this top-down force that's imposed on us.
Okay, so it's not just about, like, the government or the patriarchy telling us what to do.
Right. Foucault said that power is actually much more pervasive than that. It's something that circulates throughout society, influencing our thoughts and beliefs and behaviors.
Interesting. So where does gender fit into all of this?
Well, for Foucault, one of the key ways that power operates is through what he called discourse.
Discourse. Okay, now you're just using fancy words to make my head spin.
Sorry. It sounds complicated, but it's really not that bad.
Okay, humor me. What's discourse?
Discourse in this context refers to those systems of language and knowledge and ideas that shape how we understand the world.
So it's like the lens through which we view reality.
That's a great way to put it. And when it comes to gender, that dominant discourse is the one that reinforces this binary system of male and female with all the associated norms and expectations.
Ah, I see. So it's constantly telling us how to be a man or a woman, what's acceptable behavior, what we should desire, how we should express ourselves.
Exactly. And the tricky thing is, this discourse often presents itself as natural and inevitable, like there's no other way to be.
But Butler argues that's just an illusion, right?
Right. She says those categories are constructed and therefore they can be deconstructed.
Okay, so we've got power operating through discourse to shape our understanding of gender. But how do we break free from this? If these systems are so deeply ingrained, how do we challenge them?
That's where things get really exciting. And it's where Butler's work offers us not just a critique of the system, but also, a glimmer of hope for change.
Okay, I'm all ears. Give me some hope.
One of the key insights that Butler offers is that power isn't this monolithic, unyielding force, meaning it's not something that can't be challenged. In fact, power is constantly being negotiated, resisted, subverted.
Okay, so it's not this impenetrable wall then. There are cracks, there are ways to push back.
Exactly. And Butler suggests that one of the most powerful ways to do this is through the body.
The body. But earlier we were talking about how the body is often seen as this passive thing, just receiving cultural meaning.
Right, but it can also be a site of resistance.
So it's like the body can be both the object of power and the instrument of its undoing.
Exactly. Think about it. It's through our bodies that we perform these gender norms, right?
Yeah.
But it's also through our bodies that we can challenge them. Every time we move, speak, dress, interact in a way that defies those expectations, we're creating a moment of gender trouble.
I'm starting to see how this all connects. It's like this complex. I love that. So it's not about erasing gender altogether.
No, it's about recognizing that it's more fluid and complex than we've traditionally been led to believe.
This has been incredibly thought-provoking, but I'm not going to lie, I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed. It's like our whole understanding of gender has been cracked open.
That's the beauty of it. It challenges our assumptions, expands our perspectives. It's about opening up new possibilities.
And I have a feeling this conversation is far from over.
Oh, absolutely. There's still so much more to explore.
Well, on that note, let's give our brains a little break and come back to this in our next segment. We'll dive into some of those juicy topics we haven't even touched on yet. Okay, so we're back and ready to keep unpacking these ideas around gender. I feel like we've gone pretty deep already, but there's still so much to cover.
Yeah, we've just scratched the surface, really. But I think we've laid some good groundwork for understanding Judith Butler's perspective on all of this.
Definitely. I mean, this whole concept of gender as a performance, as something we do rather than something we are, it's pretty mind-blowing.
It is, and it challenges us to really think critically about all those assumptions we make about gender and how it operates in our lives.
Like those unspoken rules and expectations that shape our behaviors and interactions.
Exactly, those regulatory practices, as Butler calls them.
It's amazing how much influence those invisible forces have.
It really is. And one of the key tools that helps maintain those norms, reinforces that whole system, is language.
Oh, language, right. We were starting to touch on that before the break.
And it's a crucial piece of the puzzle. Butler argues that language isn't just a neutral tool for describing reality.
Okay, so it's not just about conveying information. There's more to it than that.
Much more. She suggests that language actually plays a really active role in shaping how we understand ourselves and the world around us.
So it's not just about what we say, but also how we say it, the words we choose, the labels we use.
Exactly. All of that contributes to constructing our reality, including our understanding of gender.
Like using pronouns, for example.
Yeah.
He or she instantly reinforces that gender binary.
Right. And when someone chooses to use a pronoun that doesn't align with their assigned sex at birth, it can be a powerful statement.
It's like they're saying, I'm not going to be defined by your categories.
Exactly.
Which brings us to desire. We kind of touched on this before, but I'm curious to hear more about how Butler's ideas about gender intersect with sexuality.
Yeah, it's an important intersection for sure.
I mean, if gender is this fluid, performative thing, does that mean sexual orientation is too?
That's a great question, and it's one that Butler herself has explored in her work.
So what's the answer?
Well, she doesn't necessarily offer a definitive answer, but her work definitely suggests that desire and attraction might be more complex and less fixed than we often think.
Okay, so instead of seeing sexual orientation as this rigid, unchanging category,
We might start to see it as something that's more fluid, more dynamic, something that can evolve over time.
so it's not about denying the reality or the intensity of those desires.
Right. It's about acknowledging that they might not always fit neatly into those predefined boxes.
And that people's attractions and identities can shift and change throughout their lives.
Exactly.
I really appreciate that perspective. It feels more inclusive and less restrictive. But it also raises a question for me. I mean, if we're questioning these fundamental categories of gender and sexuality, doesn't that create a lot of uncertainty? Like,
Yeah.
do we even have a framework for making sense of the world anymore?
That's a really valid concern, and it's something that Butler acknowledges. She knows that deconstructing these categories can be unsettling.
This is not about having all the answers.
Not at all. It's about being willing to ask those tough questions, challenge our assumptions, and embrace that ambiguity.
So instead of clinging to those old rigid maps, we're kind of venturing out with a compass, trusting that it will guide us even if we don't know exactly where we're going.
I love that analogy, and I think it really captures the spirit of Butler's work.
It's about the journey, not just the destination.
Exactly. It's about being open to new possibilities, new ways of understanding ourselves and each other.
Which brings us to the ethics of it all. How do we use these ideas to create a more just and inclusive world?
Right, because it's not enough to just deconstruct these categories in theory.
We have to think about the real-world implications.
Exactly. How do we make sure this deconstruction leads to something better, something more equitable?
So how do Butler's ideas translate into action?
Well, think about the fight for transgender rights, for instance.
Okay.
Butler's work helps us to see that gender identity is about so much more than biology.
It's about how people experience and express themselves.
Exactly. And that expression deserves to be respected and protected.
So instead of trying to force everyone into these rigid boxes of male and female, we can advocate for policies and practices that recognize the full spectrum of gender identity.
Exactly.
That makes sense. It's about creating a world where everyone feels safe and empowered to be their authentic selves, regardless of how they identify.
That's the goal. And it's a goal that requires us to be engaged in ongoing dialogue, to be critical of our own assumptions, and to be open to the possibility of change.
I feel like we've just scratched the surface of this, but it's been an incredible deep dive.
It has.
And I want to thank you for taking this journey with us.
It's been my pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, keep those questions coming, keep challenging those norms, and keep creating your own brand of gender trouble. Until next time.